Hello, everyone. My name is Annmarie Gajdos, and I am a senior anchor at the National Library of Patient Rights and Advocacy. Today, I am joined by Liya Moges, one of our senior researchers, to discuss her contribution to the book Harmony in Healthcare: New Visions for Mental Health in America. Liya is dedicated to promoting health equity and is currently a medical scribe at Northside Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. Today, we're going to be discussing the importance of mental health and the historical implications of stigmatization of mental health throughout history. So thank you for joining us for our little book club discussion. And take
Of
it away,
course.
Liya.
All right. What an awesome introduction. Thank you. As you said, my name is Liya. Just a general background about me. I recently graduated in biomedical science, and I have a really deep passion for journalism in general. So I think that's sort of how I got to this point. I think just writing about like this book, I think it was something that I kind of called to me because I love just being able to spread awareness about things. And even though if it may not be, other things like mental health care, it's always something healthcare related because, that's sort of my calling as well. So I think just this opportunity is definitely giving me a chance to sort of bridge the gap between, health, medicine, and as well, spreading awareness, journalism, education, things like that.
Nice. Okay, cool. Thanks for letting us know all of that information about you. Like I said, we're super excited about this. I think mental health is such an important topic that we just don't talk about enough. So super interested to get into it. So first, can you just give us a brief synopsis of the book and kind of your contributions to it? What should we know about it? Why is it important? A good resource for people.
Right. So I think in general, this book is it's sort of hodgepodge of a lot of things, to be honest. It's got a lot of concepts and topics that a lot of us authors sort of decided were most important or weren't really discussed about, in general in other books. We touch on a lot of subjects like, if stigmatization of, mental health care, the history behind it, and like psychiatry and therapy in general. And we also touch on a lot of other subjects like things that you might be thinking in your own head that maybe you wouldn't really ask out loud. Like, is it okay to be in therapy for, a long period of time? Something that, is good, one good thing too much, if it turns into a bad thing. And we do touch on subjects like that and we try to give some solutions as well to the best of our ability based on the information that we've gathered. And I think it's something that a lot of people will enjoy. It's pretty unique in that way because it's sort of like a bunch of authors who have decided what we feel is important that the readers should know. And I know in general, most people who are like writing books as an author, it's most of the time it's probably one author in one voice. But I think that's what differentiates our book from a lot of that because a lot of us come from different backgrounds and we have different opinions on what we think is most important and what we should share the most. And I think the way we split up the chapters has really allowed us to really be able to, share our voices on the things that we feel matter most. And I think our editors do an amazing job of, being able to compile all that information and making sure that it flows well whilst our distinct voices inside of it.
Nice. Okay, cool. And so I'm wondering, a lot of times when we talk about healthcare, I feel like people don't always understand all the terminology, the lingo. And so how did you kind of tackle that in the book, like, and make it more accessible for people when reading?
I think, in my personal opinion, I don't know about the other authors, but oftentimes I like to run my idea by some family members or
Oh,
friends.
okay. I like
So
that.
sometimes, yeah, sometimes if I feel like I'm going on a tangent, I'll sort of just ask maybe like my brother, I'll be like, hey, tell me what you think about this sentence. CBT did it, and he's like, wait, I don't know what CBT means. And I'm like, point taken. Let me explain that further, and I feel like having that interaction and conversation with people really shows you like while I may know what it means because I'm the one who did the research, looked at a bunch of articles to figure out what it means. Like, a lot of times those are the kind of jargon that can like make people stay away from informational books like this.
Hmm.
Like, I don't want to read all this. I don't know what this means.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel like always bringing it to a sibling will like humble you in the most
For
utmost
sure.
respect. So perfect, perfect way to go about it, in my opinion. All right. And so how does this book contribute to this ongoing conversation about mental health? How do you think like this can actually help someone who's struggling with this idea of going to therapy, not going, kind of looking for the right person for them? What can they get out of this book?
I think in general, this topic is definitely something that's always been talked about recently. But I think it's one of those things where we try our best to focus on the biggest concepts, the overall arching theme that we see happens or is talked about the most, just so we feel like we're covering a good basis, because it isn't really the best idea to sort of jump into a certain detail when people don't really know why you're doing it. Like, what is this detail based on? And so we try to facilitate like a really good discussion and have good flow to show that, there's different things like um, trying to get rid of this judgment that people have when they're hearing about concepts like this. We're trying to, like, promote awareness, try to help the individual who may or may not be struggling. It doesn't have to be someone who themselves is struggling, but maybe a family member or a friend who's struggling, and it can sort of just help you in that way. And I feel like our book does a really good job of trying to break it down by general concept and then going into those details slowly but surely, without, feeling like we're just attacking you with a bunch of information.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's good to have everything broken down and give people the space to kind of get into that rhythm of reading.
Mhm.
And so back to like just this topic of mental health, why do you think it's important for talking about mental health, therapy, all these things to be part of this mainstream conversation?
I think in general, that's really just us trying to stop this stigma and bias and judgment about it. And I think the more you talk about certain things, the more you start to get used to hearing about it. And it won't be one of those things where when you're talking to someone and they say, oh, I struggle with depression, it's not going to be one of those things where you're like, whoa, why did
How
they
do I
just drop that
respond?
bomb? Yeah. Like, why did they just drop that? We want to make people comfortable to talk about it. It's and writing a book about it and whatnot. I think that's one of the ways where you're just sort of like, they say it so casually here, so it must not be something so huge to make a big deal out of when you see people trying to seek out help about it.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And why do you think mental health is so stigmatized historically? Like, are there any historical origins to it? Do you think it's just the lack of talking about it? And also, what is your experience with mental health? Like, have you experienced these things before? Like, is that kind of a reason you got into it?
So me personally, I've never struggled with that, fortunately. But I have had friends who have struggled with that kind of problem. And it's always sort of a scary thing, sort of being a bystander to all of it, because you're sort of like, I wish there was something that I could personally do for you. I
Mhm.
really do. But sometimes you're sort of just stuck in this limbo where you're not educated enough and you don't really know enough about it. And it kind of makes you want to be like, hey, I this feels like something I should know, and it's not just because my friend has it, but it feels like this is a general theme of life. Like, you should be able to understand why people feel upset or what you should do when people feel upset in general. And that's just speaking on just like, depression and whatnot. But I think that's sort of what just got me writing into it, and sort of being interested about it and taking a look at it. And I think just for as for the history, I think a lot of it is tied into what I would say spiritual and religious, I want to say themes. So a lot of the times, way back in like the Mesopotamia, Egypt kind of times, I would say that a lot of their misconceptions of like mental health and therapy really come from just the lack of understanding from back then. A lot of times, when someone was deemed to have like some sort of mental illness, they were like, "Oh, you angered some kind of god in your past life, and you need to redeem yourself." And it was followed up with like, I guess, rituals, incantations, spells, whatever they felt like was within the realm of religion and spirituality. And a lot of times, because of that, it was really left unchecked. And I think it wasn't until like, I want to say the 1800s, 1900s, where they were sort of taking mental health a little more seriously.
Hmm.
It was still not, I would say, in my opinion, looking at the research, they still treated the patients a bit barbarically. There was a lot of times where the patients were mistreated as well, only because they had these stigmas where they were like, oh, they have a mental illness. They can't feel the way we feel. So
Mm.
they would do a lot of like surgeries and treatment plans that would invoke pain, but they wouldn't give them, any like medication to subdue the pain or any anesthetics or anything like that, because they just genuinely felt like, they don't feel the same way we do, so they're fine.
Oh
And
my gosh.
it's disastrous reading on it, but it was really one of those things where patients really started realizing that, hey, we need to speak up about this. And that was sort of what led them to having, like, this little social reform movement where they started speaking out about how they were mistreated and how there's got to be a different way. And it wasn't until, I guess some social reformers and psychological thinkers came up, like William James, people who started up with like functionalism, structuralism. I won't get too much in detail about that because it's in the book, but a lot of new thinkers are the ones that started heading up this idea of, hey, let's start taking a deeper dive into the human brain. Let's really figure out what exactly is going on here, so we can try and actually be better and do better when treating our patients.
Definitely. And I think it's so interesting because when we talk about mental health, it's one of those things where sometimes you just don't know that you're struggling with something until you talk to somebody else. I mean, it's not like having a physical disability or a physical ailment where it's like you can see the blood coming from your arm, you can see
Right.
like the actual thing happening. And I was talking to somebody recently at a breathwork class, and one of my friends, she's prone to anxiety, just like me. And
Mhm.
she was like, oh, I just feel anxious about everything. And I was like, yeah, but I feel like that's just normal. It's just, sometimes you just go
Yeah.
through it. And the third friend that was sitting with us, she was like, "No, I never feel that way." And for
Uh,
me, it was like such a shock. Like me having thought I knew a lot about mental health, I was like, "Oh, like people don't, not everybody has these problems."
right,
And I thought it was
right.
so crazy because it's like you have your reality, and like unless you speak to someone else, you don't really know kind of what's going on. So I'm wondering, like, in your opinion and from the research, like how much of this is like generational? How do people kind of realize that they're struggling with something? And like, I don't know, how does that tie into the medical aspect of it?
I think it's really one of those things where you really stumble upon it in conversation, where you're discussing the way you feel with people, and people are like, that shouldn't be the way you feel.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what opens your eyes. And I definitely think generational wise, we're lucky in this generation where we're a lot more vocal about those kind of problems. But I know definitely back then, a lot of people were afraid to step up and speak out because there was a lot of stigma, judgment, bias. It was considered a taboo, I guess, and you weren't really treated the best afterwards. And I think just growing as a society, we're finally able to be vocal about it and not feel so alienated once we do. And I think that's just one of the things where, as medical practices, continue to advance, we sort of just begin to realize that everything is, I would say, like a scale. you know
Mhm.
we're measuring things, we're trying to figure things out, and we're trying to figure out why you feel this way, what's making you feel this way, how can we fix it, what are the next steps. It's always this, let's keep pushing to figure out what we can do about it. I think our generation is really good about not just staying still. We're pretty active about things. When we hear about things, we'll post about it, we'll try and talk about it with people. And I think that's one of the best things that we could possibly do as a society.
Yeah, I agree. It's so funny because my dad, he also struggled with mental health. My sister, same thing. And when I would talk to him, he like it only came up in conversation because me and my sister were telling him, like, hey, like we're thinking about going to therapy. And he was like, oh yeah, I wish I had done that when I was your age. I was
Mhm.
like, sir, excuse me. So it's funny how much of this is just like found out through conversation. And like you said, I think our generation is doing such a good job about speaking about mental health and kind of just bringing therapy to the forefront and making it more of a topic that we can discuss. Because
Mhm.
it's still like, I think in some degree there still is some stigmatization around it, and there's this idea of like, oh
Right.
my gosh, if I go there's something wrong with me. But
Mhm.
also then there's the idea that there are some people that actually struggle with it, they need medication, and there are all these things related to it medically. And so I'm wondering, can you tell me maybe some common misconceptions about therapy and kind of how this perpetuates the stigmatization?
Right. So I think the common things that we hear when you sort of bring up the conversation about, oh, maybe I want to go to therapy, you'll hear a lot of like, therapy is for crazy people and therapy is a sign of weakness. You don't need to go to someone and pay someone to hear about your problems. And I think the biggest thing that we should get across is that none of that is true. These, I would feel, are sort of like, I want to say, ignorant conversation enders.
Right.
This is sort of something that you're supposed to take really seriously when someone opens up about, wanting to go to therapy, and sort of just being that person kind of just downplays everything and says, oh, you don't need it. You don't need it. That really kind of like, I want to say, set society back, because we should be above that. We should be someone who wants to encourage and support people who are willing to go out of their way and out of their comfort zone to seek help, you know? Therapy is beneficial to literally anyone. Even if you're like facing what you think is a minor like a minor thing, like, oh, I'm stressed out at work. Therapy can help with that, having someone to talk to. And even though people say, oh, you don't need to pay someone to talk to about that, maybe you want just professional advice. Some friends' advice would be like, ooh, girl, just quit your job. You know that you can't quit your job.
I really
At least
can't.
not all the time. You got bills to pay. You can't just quit your job. Maybe you want to hear some productive advice from a professional who'll say, okay, let's try to take steps to figure out who is a trigger, who's starting these problems for you, how can you avoid it, what can you say to end the problem, things like that. So therapy is really just quite literally for anyone and anything. Relationship problems doesn't have to just be with you and whoever you're dating, but it could be maybe you have some friends that cause you a bit of stress in your life, some anxiety, some friends who are I guess I would say toxic or anything, or maybe you have family members that you just don't click with like you'd want to. You want to repair a relationship. It doesn't have to always just be a negative thing. But I think it's just things like that. Therapy can really help in a lot of ways. And I think just undermining someone's, I want to say, bravery to come out and say, I think I need help and I want to seek that out. It's really not fair as a person to witness that happen, because you're just like, you're trying to be strong and people are trying to tell you that you're weak, you know, and that's really messed up, I would say. But yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. I think if someone's speaking out, it's not because they want to, it's probably because they're at a point where it's like, I really need help. And so I think so
Exactly.
often we don't notice or pay attention to these cries for help. And then we're like, oh my gosh, why didn't they say
Hmm.
anything? And it's like, no, they did. You just weren't really actively listening.
Yep, exactly. And we're not trained to notice these kind of things. What
No, of
you
course.
may think is a casual joke could be, a small cry for help. And I think that's the importance of going to therapy. Once you've admitted to yourself and once you've realized that you need help, you're realizing that there's someone who's trained to help you. This person has medical expertise. What you may say as a joke in front of your friends could be like, something important for your therapist to take note of.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And so on that topic, I kind of want to know, in terms of finding a therapist, what do you think is a good process? I know a lot of people say like therapy is kind of like dating, finding the right match for you. So if someone's interested in going to therapy, how can they kind of get this process started? Like, how do they find someone who's a good fit for them? And like, is this something that's going to take them a couple of tries, or is it usually like
Mhm.
instantaneous?
I mean, all the time I'm always seeing ads on like social media for like, I think there's like companies out there that, will always put out ads about, oh, you should it's easy to find a therapist online. There's apps for it. And I would just say to, even though I would definitely recommend checking them out, always take it with a small grain of salt, because, not every therapist's approach may match your, I guess, I would say the way you want to handle things.
Mm,
It's always important to really be open in conversation and discussing with the therapist that you're trying to find, what goals you're trying to achieve, what the problems are that you want to work towards solving. And I would say just really be honest with yourself and seeing, do you genuinely believe that this therapist or like, provider is seeing your problem? Because it's really easy to get caught up in this idea or like, they're a doctor. Of course, they know best for me. But sometimes you should really try to advocate for yourself when you feel like a professional, like a healthcare professional, isn't really meeting your goals or your standards. If you feel like you're not really going anywhere, of course, you can always like try to take time to see progress, before anything happens. You're not going to be fixed in a day. But I think if you're going, for a few months and you find like you're in the exact same place started, that's definitely a sign for you to try and find somebody else, or really just be open with your therapist and say, hey, I don't think what we've been doing is working. And try to move forward from there.
definitely. And I think that is such a good segue because you're also doing a lot of research on long-term therapy. So I'm wondering,
Hmm.
like, what is the goal of therapy at the end of the day? Like, should you be going to therapy your whole life? Is this meant to be like a lifelong process? Or I know some people will go for like a couple of months and be like, oh, I feel like my problem was solved. Like, I know it's different for every single person, but what does long-term therapy look like? And is that kind of the goal for everybody?
I think I think with therapy, I don't necessarily, based on the research that I've done, I
Mhm.
don't think it's necessarily meant to be a long-term thing unless the mental illness or like the problem that you're discussing is something that has been excessively building up over time. Maybe it's something that you've had a problem with since childhood and now you're like a grown adult and you're finding out that there's levels to this that you're
Mhm.
unraveling slowly but surely. But I think most of the time, therapy is best in shorter periods of time because a lot of times when people go do things for long periods of time, you're expecting results. And when you don't see them, you get disappointed and you feel like you're regressing or you feel like you're spiraling because you're like, hey, I've been in therapy for 2 years and I don't feel different. That's when you start, the progress that you initially made starts to become invisible to you. And I think having excessive therapy can also sort of make you dependent on your therapist because at the end of the day, a therapist is someone you've built trust with. You trust them a lot because you're telling them about your problems and the things that really bother you most. And eventually you'll find that you're not opening up to anybody else anymore. You're not talking to your family or your friends. The first person you go to is your therapist. And while that's usually a good thing in certain cases, this can also cause some rifts between the other relationships that you have. Maybe you have a significant other and your significant other's feeling like you're not opening up to them anymore. It feels like you're hiding things from them because you're like, oh, I want to save this for my therapist, not you, you know? There's also a grain of salt with having too short of a time where you're only giving yourself 2 weeks to fix a problem that you probably had for 8 years.
Yeah.
So it's always this thing. It's like a balancing scale, which is why I'm saying it's really important that you talk to your therapist and discuss how long do you think you should be here? How long do you think realistically that you will be here? Because not all the time where your expectations will match reality. Sometimes you'll think you have a problem that you think can be solved in 2 months, but then your therapist is like, no, you need more time. And you'll be a bit disappointed, but at the end of the day, you'll know that your therapist is looking out for you? But yeah.
Definitely. And so, I mean, it seems like this process of building trust with your therapist is super important. And how do you
Mhm.
think, I guess, a patient could really build this trust with their therapist? Like, how can they maintain this relationship that's like professional at the same time it's super personal because you're sharing all of your information? So, what does that relationship kind of look like?
I'm thinking I personally haven't gone to therapy, so
Hmm.
it's a bit hard to discuss how I would personally go about it.
Yeah.
However, based on, the research that I've done and, sort of speaking to friends who've gone to therapy, I think it's one of those things where you have to discuss with your therapist, is there a line that I shouldn't cross?
Hmm.
Maybe texting them 24/7 about everything that may seem inconvenient to you can actually build some maladaptive behavior because now you're too dependent on them. Every time you have a problem, you're going straight to them when your therapist really wants to help you build relationships with other people as well. Your relationship isn't just a you and therapist, it's you and therapist is trying to help you rely on the family and the friends that you have around you. They're trying to help you build on other, I want to say, like feelings and other interactions and relationships that you have around yourself so that when you do leave therapy, it's something that you can rely on and you won't have to come back as often, I guess.
Definitely. Okay,
Mhm.
awesome. And so I'm gonna have one final question for you. I just want to
Okay.
know, based on your research, based on everything you've studied for this book, what was one of your biggest takeaways? What do you kind of want to leave the audience knowing if they haven't read the book yet?
I would say that build trust with yourself and obviously, with the healthcare provider that you choose to seek out for help, but also know that constantly people around you are trying to build up a system in society that will also support you. I think one of the things that I personally found out was that I think we always think that we're all alone in the journey. We feel like, oh, I feel like nobody talks about this. The government isn't doing enough. But there's plenty of people who are working behind the scenes that are trying to help share the story, spread awareness, build policies and legislation that will get passed to help move things forward, you know. If you can believe it or not, you know, back in like I guess I would say early 1900s, there were no laws saying that there was insurance for mental health, you know. Going to therapy, that was excessively billed, you know. That was a separate thing, which is what made people not want to go. And
Yeah.
now, you know, after 2008, you know, President Obama has passed things like the Affordable Care Act that is helping people be able to pay for these services so that they can actually get help. So I think just one of the important things just for this book is just know that there's people out there who are fighting for your cause as well. You're not the only one. There's people in high places as well that are fighting for your cause. And, you know, do your best to really do the research that you need to help yourself.
I love that. Oh my gosh, such a positive, hopeful note. I felt inspired by that. To piggyback off of that, I'm just curious in terms of like the healthcare legislation that you've researched, kind of what do you see the pros and cons of it being, and kind of where do you hope for this legislation to go?
I mean, I'm hoping that, you know, it continues to get covered by insurance.
I
That's
think we
one
all
thing.
are.
I think the only con that I can think of is that, you know, obviously there are some people that try to get rid of those kind of policies because they feel like it's taking too much of the government expenditure, I guess. But honestly, I think the only thing that we can do as a society is continue to push forward, vote, you know, make sure that you're actually doing your part when it comes down to it because, you know, these laws just don't get passed on their own. It's got to start somewhere, and it starts from the people and it builds its way up, you know. So it's definitely something that I would say is a slow but steady process that happens over time.
It's so true. And I think it's so important just having this in the rhetoric, making it more accessible and more known. Like you said, we
Mhm.
didn't have legislation for this prior to
Yeah,
Obama. So it's kind of crazy, but it's happening and like we're getting more and more support. So I think it's super impactful and I'm really excited for this book. I gotta get my copy and read some more. Do you want to tell people maybe where they can find it, how they can access it?
I think it's definitely for sale on Amazon. I'm
Okay,
not sure
nice.
where else it's being sold.
I mean, if it's on Amazon, you already have access. That's the
Yeah.
place.
As long as you got internet, you've got the book, you've got the access to
Exactly.
buy it.
Accessible, like we were talking about, access, so important.
Absolutely, you've got it right here.
Oh, she's
You
got
guys
it
should buy
today.
the book. You should buy it.
And she
It's
got her sticky notes in it too. Guys, she came prepared.
I've come prepared because this message is important to me.
I love it. Well, okay, thank you so much, Liya. This was super
Absolutely.
insightful, super impactful. I'm just so glad we got to chat.
I'm so glad as well. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. And everybody, make sure you get your copy on Amazon of Harmony in Healthcare, New Visions for Mental Health in America.